Brian Glover. In this video, I wanted to talk about the genocide of Christians and how different administrations have handled the genocide of Christians and addressed it and what they've done actually to help Christians around the world who are, facing persecution for their faith. And let's start with the Obama administration. So there was criticism from congressional leaders and human rights groups urging the White House to formally recognize ISIS-led attacks against Christians and other minorities as genocide. Some letters and petitions called for the administration to designate these atrocities as genocide to better support victims and ensure accountability. However, the administration was reported to have stopped short of officially labeling ISIS attacks on Christians as genocide, focusing more on Yazidis. So they didn't want to label it genocide because if they have to label it genocide, then they have to do something. That's how, the Clinton administration, if you recall the genocide in Rwanda, what did they do so that they didn't have to get involved? They didn't call it genocide, because if they actually call it genocide, then the White House has to do something. So under the Trump administration, there was active rhetoric and initiatives aimed at protecting Christians facing persecution globally. Trump spoke about helping Christians facing genocide by ISIS in the Middle East and created a Justice Department task force to combat anti-Christian discrimination within the U.S. government. However, at the same time, his administration reduced refugee admissions, including Christian refugees fleeing persecution. And we've seen this in the news, how Trump specifically is making it harder for people from countries where there are brown people to come here. And I would say that's proof that his administration is xenophobic. And we've seen how he's labeled, countries where there are brown people. We've seen his comments about Haiti. And I don't know, if Trump is racist. And I think, though, it shows that he has a preference for European countries. And also we see, that he labeled, the persecution in South Africa. And there's not genocide going on in South Africa where they should be considered refugees over, some of the atrocities that are going on here in Nigeria and, other countries where Christians are being persecuted. So more recently, in 2025, Republican lawmakers have been pushing Congress to formally condemn persecution against Christians in Muslim majority countries and urge the president to prioritize the defense of persecuted Christians in U.S. foreign policy. When Fox News contacted the White House for comment on this push, no statement was provided. And isn't it odd? Because, doesn't he have a base of Christian supporters, evangelicals, mostly support Trump? And it would seem that, he's a Christian. So it would seem like his administration would take a more forward stance. So there's a lot that the White House could do to help these Christians who are being persecuted. But the White House has issued presidential messages honoring Christian communities on significant days like Global Coptic Day and Pentecost, acknowledging ongoing persecution, but without explicit labels like genocide in these statements. See, again, we have the president refusing to label it as genocide, because if he labels it as genocide, then the United States has to do something. You see how that works? And make no doubt about it, it is genocide going on across the world in several different countries, whether it's Syria, Nigeria, just to name a couple. The Biden administration faced criticism from Christian conservatives who claim anti-Christian bias, which Trump tried to address by setting up a task force to investigate such claims. Basically, the White House has recognized the persecution and suffering of Christians in parts of the world, with efforts to aid and condemn such acts. However, formal declaration of genocide specifically directed at Christians has been contentious, with various advocacy groups pushing for explicit recognition. and mixed responses from the executive branch depending on the administration. The latest push by lawmakers calls for stronger U.S. condemnation and diplomatic efforts to protect persecuted Christian minority groups globally. Donald Trump has taken several public steps to defend Christians, especially within the United States, but his record on assisting persecuted Christians abroad is mixed and has faced criticism from multiple perspectives. Trump has made protecting Christians a major theme of his political messaging and policy in the U.S. He established a White House faith office and signed executive orders creating a task force to eradicate anti-Christian bias in federal agencies. These efforts are aimed primarily as what he frames as domestic anti-Christian discrimination, such as ensuring Christian rights in schools, workplaces, the military, and government institutions. Because there is a bias for Christians in the U.S. And I mean, I think that's really important, but it's nothing compared to the persecution that Christians are facing in countries like Nigeria, for instance, where you could be sleeping in your bed one night and Fulani herdsmen come in and cut your head off because you're not Islam, you're not a Muslim, or take your daughter as a sex slave. And I think that is a horrible reality for anyone to live in. And I think that I would like to see the president step up and do more to really protect Christians around the world that are facing persecution, specifically because of extremist Islam. And Trump has made executive orders that declare the advancement of international religious freedom a U.S. foreign policy priority. These orders directed government agencies to develop strategic plans and allocate funding. Example, $50 million a year for religious freedom, including programs to aid persecuted religious minorities such as Christians. U.S. missions were tasked with supporting persecuted religious groups through diplomatic engagement and humanitarian aid. And the Trump administration was vocal at the United Nations and in diplomatic alliances about religious persecution worldwide. However, critics point out significant shortcomings. Like I said before, his travel bans and his dramatic reduction of refugee admissions, including Christian refugees, meant that many persecuted Christians could not find safe harbor in the U.S. during his administration. Christian refugees admissions reportedly declined by nearly 80%. Policy shifts meant that even those fleeing violence specifically because of their faith faced barriers to entry. While Trump publicly favored Christians in diplomatic messaging, critics argue that his foreign policy moves often emphasize domestic policies or symbolic gestures over meaningful aid or intervention in crisis zones. For example, his policies were less consistent or supportive regarding Christian minorities in places like Iraq and Syria, despite high levels of violence against them. Some faith leaders and legislators have argued the administration to do more, citing ongoing violence against Christians in regions such as Nigeria and Pakistan. Human rights groups also noted that some administration initiatives, while protective of Christians, sometimes failed to address persecution and violence against other religious minorities, suggesting a lack of universal application of religious freedom principles. So basically, Trump talks a big game that, he's in favor of helping refugees, but how is he really helping refugees when he's instituting travel bans and refusing to accept refugees from certain countries, particularly if you're from a country like Syria or you're from a country like Nigeria? Trump is basically making it very difficult for those people to come here and escape religious persecution. And I think that's unfortunate. It shows the xenophobia of the Trump White House. And let me know in the comments what you guys think about this video. What do you think that the Trump administration can do to help these refugees worldwide? Would you like to see them do more? Why do you feel that this isn't getting more topic on national news and the mainstream news isn't talking about it? So make sure you guys like, comment, subscribe, follow me on social media, check out my other videos, and I appreciate you guys.